Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just going to let a few more folks join us from the waiting room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Looks like everyone is in, so let's go ahead and get started. Wanted to first start off by just welcoming you all. Thank you so much for your interest in this series and for taking the time to join us today. This is the first session in our Racism and Food Access and Nutrition Culture discussion series. Today's session is called One Bad Apple: How the Lack of Knowledge about Black and Indigenous Food Histories Informs Our Nutrition Work. My name is Catherine Bernstein. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joined today by my colleagues and co-planners, Martha Margaret Cotton and Lucy Peterson. And you'll be hearing more from Martha Margaret shortly. So we're all, next slide, please. We're all with an organization called the Illinois Public Health Institute, which we call IPHI for short. IPHI is a statewide nonprofit, and our mission is to mobilize stakeholders, catalyze partnerships, and lead action to improve public health systems in order to maximize health equity, and quality of life for people in communities. Next slide. This series is supported by the Building Resilient Inclusive Communities, or BRIC grant program. BRIC was established in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's designed to work towards nutrition security, social connectedness, and opportunities for safe physical activity. In Illinois, we prioritize the Southern Seven, St. Clair, and Peoria communities. And this series is a crucial component of that work and other work as well. I would like to note that for this series was made possible in part by funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does anything said or shared imply endorsement by the US government. Before we go any further, we would like to take a moment to recognize and reflect on the fact that IPHI offices are on the unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Mia, Oceti, Sakowin, Kaskaskia, and Kickapoo nations. Colonizers stole the land we are on and forcibly removed its inhabitants. While this certainly needs to be acknowledged, it's critically important that we go beyond making a statement. Indigenous communities have shown incredible perseverance and continue to bear the weight of colonization. Much needs to be done to ameliorate these wrongs. Our team recognizes we have an incredible amount to learn, and we are early in our journey to discover the role we can play. And we invite everyone to join us. Please keep this in mind during our action planning segment at the close of the second session on Tuesday, September 27th. If you don't know whose land you're on, the source on the slide and in the chat is a place to start. Like our team, you and your organizations might also consider supporting Indigenous communities by donating your time, money, and by joining Indigenous-led movements and campaigns. Additional resources are included in the worksheet that we'll send after today's session, and I know we'll learn a lot more today and during the next session as well. So a little bit of housekeeping. You are all muted, as I'm sure you've noticed. Cameras are welcome and certainly encouraged, especially for the discussion portions of today's session. Please feel free to reach out to Martha Margaret by private chat or at the email address on the slide if you experience any technical difficulties. We will share the recording of this session, and we encourage you all to share the recording as well with anyone who wasn't able to join us. Please plan to join the second session as well, which is on Tuesday, September 27th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. Next slide, thanks. We invite you to put questions in the chat anytime. We'll start a list to share with Dr. Williams-Forson when the time is right. And once Dr. Williams-Forson does open the floor to questions, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, please raise your virtual hand to be unmuted. In order to raise your hand, you can click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and then the raise hand button as pictured on the slide. Now I'd like to go ahead and pass it to Martha Margaret to facilitate introductions.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. We're truly so thankful that you all are interested in this topic, and we're just overall very excited to bring this to you. So now we would like for you all to share a bit about yourself. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing. A couple ideas are name, your pronouns, where you're joining from, any affiliations, and we would really love it if you could share one meal that you've already had or plan to have today. And you can go ahead and share that in the chat. I'm not gonna lie, this morning I had a muffin, so that's what I've had today. And I'll just give everyone a minute or so, some yogurt, some berries, a pear, some very healthy breakfast. All right, oatmeal and berries. These look good. So while you all are doing that, I see the waterfall falling in. This is great. We'll go to the next slide, and we have a poll for you. So I'm going to launch it, and please feel free to click whichever number you feel confident in placing. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how knowledgeable are you about how racism, oppression, and colonialism have shaped American food access and nutrition culture, and what providers can do to challenge these systems? So I'll give you all a minute. Give it another minute or so. Still see them rolling in. We have about 147 people on the call, and we still only have about 117. So I want to give people time. All right. So I will go ahead and end that now, just for the sake of time. And so as you can see, everyone, for the most part, ranks around a 3. So good to know. And we hope that you can learn a little bit more from today and the rest of the series. All right. Next slide, please. So we would like to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson, professor and chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland College Park. Dr. Williams-Forson is the author of Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, Taking Food Public, Redefining Food in a Changing World, a co-edited collection with Carol Cunahan, and the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. She is known nationally and internationally for her pioneering work in building the scholarly subfield of Black food studies, and has published numerous articles on this aspect of the material lives of African Americans in the US from the late 19th century to the present. And Catherine will put a link to her further bio in the chat, so you can feel free to look at that as well to see all the other things that she's done. So without further ado, I'll turn it right over to you, Dr. Williams-Forson.
Great, thank you. Good morning, good morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. First of all, thank you all for having me out this morning. I want to thank the planning committee for all the hard work that was done to get us to this place. I'm really excited today to talk with you all, not to you all, but with you all. And I'm also really excited to know that so many folks actually are already familiar with the topic. So that means that we'll have a much more time for a robust conversation, which is exciting.
Dr.
But I'm
Williams-Forson, I apologize for the introduction. We're seeing the notes version of your slide. If you want to
okay, you're
switch the
seeing the
display.
notes version. Yes, then I need for you to see the slideshow. All right, perfect.
Perfect. Thank
Is
you.
that great? Okay. So, as I said, this should be a really good conversation since so many of you all are already familiar. I want to start this morning by, first of all, asking you all to just, you asked to do the assignment of indicating what you have for breakfast. And now I want to move you actually into your home, if you will. And I want you to imagine that you're heading home this afternoon or evening or when have you, wherever you call your place of stay, wherever you call home. And you get there and you realize that something is not quite how I left it. Okay, this is maybe a fictional space. So just, bear with me. Even as you stand there, little by little, you start to see your house or your home disappear. Objects in your home start to just disappear until all that remains really is a sliver of what made your house a home. Okay. Now I want you to imagine that this was all done without your permission. And I want you to also imagine that it was done by someone who is a stranger to you. Okay. And then lastly, I want you to think about how all of this would make you feel. Would you be confused? Would you be angry? What exactly would be your own emotion? All right, let me get back here. Would it be that you're mad, frustrated? Perhaps you want to be rebellious? Why do I ask these questions? Because this is really what happens when we insist upon people changing their food ways. When we insist upon it, or when we are even staunch advocates on some level, right? It's because food is not just food. And this is the thing, we tend to objectify it. We tend to remove ourselves from it. But food is a set of objects, just like our phones, our clothes, our books, the things we have in our house. Food is a very personal engagement with a material world. All right. And so when we sometimes try to say to people, well, what you're eating is killing you, blah, 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 we really have to ground what we're saying to people in a different set of thoughts. Why? Because conceptualizing food choice is a very complex process with a range of influences and values that are negotiated differently by diverse people in a variety of settings. And that's from Tanis First and others. Right. And I noticed in the questions that the question that was asked about what you all had for breakfast, a lot of you mentioned fruit, but some of you mentioned leftovers from last night. Others of you mentioned things that might be considered dinner foods, right? And again, these are really important concepts because we're all making these very difficult decisions under a number of different influences. So we have to be careful about how we assume, what's right for one person and another. My colleague, Charlotte Biltikoff, says it this way, and I really like this quote. She says, if we're going to bother with this at all, we may as well start to imagine a new way of thinking that starts from the premise that our dietary health really cannot just be considered from a scientific or purely scientific or medical perspective, but that we also have to bring in the cultural perspective, right? So she says, talking about food is going to require some really radical, productively unsettling conversations, collaborations, cross-fertilizations across social, disciplinary, and professional divides, because oftentimes we try to come at this very intensely personal experience from a purely scientific or medical perspective. It also can't be taken a look at from a purely cultural perspective, but rather we need to be able to have all of those aspects in conversation with each other. So that leads me to something that I really am passionate about, and that is the fourth pillar, if you will, of sustainability, right? We have what is called often the triple bottom line, which is people and profit and so forth, but that we often leave out culture. And I like how UNESCO says it here, and that is that cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature. Right? It becomes one of the roots of development, understood not simply in terms of economic growth, but also as a means to achieve a more satisfactory, intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual existence. So we have to be attentive to what makes up cultural diversity. All right, so having said all of that, I want to just go back a little bit because there's history here. Right? We want to remember that nothing that we're experiencing today is necessarily brand new. It's all grounded in historical precedent. And over time, it has built up to erupt, or it has built up to where we are today to be making the types of assumptions and leaps and thoughts that we have, right? A large part of the first part of my comments are going to come from one of the many articles that I suggested that you all might want to take a look at between this webinar and the next one. And that is an article called African and Native American Foodways and Resilience. And this is an article that is accessible online. It's a great article written for the National Institutes of Health, but it's very accessible. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at it. So I just want to start with the fact that long before Africans were kidnapped and brought to the Americas, brought to the Caribbean, we were agriculturalists, we were hunters, fishers, foragers, cultivated wild foods, domestic animals. We grew a host of crops and gardens, right? And similarly, so did indigenous people. They survived off the land here in this country long before they encountered Europeans and settlers. And in both North America and West Africa, we have documentation that tells us that from travel accounts, that the human existence at that time really was engaged with a plentiful bounty, that is the land, right? So in 1634, for example, Captain Thomas Young wrote of the journey to Jamestown, Virginia. And here's what he said. He noticed that there were plenty of birds and fowls and foods. And he wrote, and I'm quoting here, and so much so that in ordinary planters' houses of the better sort, or he didn't write this, but the scholar who was talking about him said that in so much so that in the ordinary planters' houses of the better sort, we found tables furnished with pork, kids, chickens, turkeys, young geese, caponets, and other fowls as the seas of the year afforded. So what am I saying there? In the 1600s, you have to remember we were very gardenous, we had lush areas, and so forth and so on. And so people were able to eat bountifully off the land. And so I'm saying this because we hear a lot, especially about African Americans, that, you know, their foodways came from scraps. Okay, that's actually not true. First of all, enslavement lasted over 400 years, right? And in this country, we're talking from the late mid 1600s to the 1800s. So you're talking about 200 years at least of bondage. All right. So that means you went through different phases and there were different evolutions that took place. So to just simply say that African people ate scraps is not correct. Muslims, for example, came by way of the Middle Passage. Others who practiced different indigenous religions where meat or pork may or may not have been consumed were also a part of that human chattel. So we have to be very careful about assuming that Black folks in particular ate these kinds of foods that were just the offal or the leftovers. From the standpoint of Native people, of course, we know there were so many different kinds of foods they had access to, similarly to the settlers, wild game, fish, freshwater turtle, and a variety of vegetables and so forth. And in fact, were it not for Native people and then later Africans as well, the settlers really would not have survived because they were unfamiliar with the land and the territory. So Africans came to this country by way of the transatlantic slave trade. And you can see the myriad routes that were taken and the millions of Africans who were brought to this country, despite what's circulating on social media right now, that the majority of Africans were born in this country. They were not. You had some almost 14 million Black diasporic peoples, human bodies that were brought to North America, South America, Europe, and other locales. And so by the time you get here, and even before then, in the 1500s, West Africans had been exposed to foods like cassava and peanuts and maize, which was first cultivated from wild grasses by the people indigenous to South America. So Africans came to this country with a fair amount of food cultures. Okay, that's my point. We came here with these foods. Some of these foods were provisioned on in the slave ships, and that's how they came to this new world, so forth and so on. All right. The other thing we have to be very clear about is that enslavement was both a racial and economic enterprise. Again, right now circulating on social media, especially Twitter, is this ludicrous conversation that enslavement was not profitable. Absolutely it was. Cotton was king. Tobacco was produced and made great wealth. African people built this country as free labor, building all kinds of structures and infrastructures. And so we have to, again, recognize that in all of these happenings, food is ever present. All right, food is ever present. So in the colonial era, for example, and these images here are coming from specifically the Chesapeake. And I'm showing them because, again, depending upon where you were enslaved would determine what you had access to. Right, so here in the Chesapeake region, where we have the Piscataway and now the Lumbee also are in the Baltimore region, you would have had access to all kinds of fish and shellfish that are in the bay. You would have, as an African person, you would have created a number of one-pot meals, and these on the left here, I think it's on the left of your screen, there's some images of colonial ware where there would have been a lot of one-pot kinds of meals made, maybe from berries, beans, herbs, whatever kinds of leftover meat you could find, or fresh kill that you had. You could make an entire stew or soup or what have you, right? And so these are the kinds of eatings that were taking place in food cultures that were being cultivated in the New World by enslaved Africans, right? So by 1619, during the transatlantic slave trade, we know that the vast majority of enslaved folks were taken to the Caribbean and South America, and then on to what is now the US. And so by the time many enslaved people reached this country, they had access to a lot of different food cultures. Okay. Meanwhile, you had Native people who were fighting to retain their traditional lands and foodways as well. Native Americans adopted, for example, black-eyed peas to such an extent, according to this article that I was referring you to, that some mistakenly thought they originated in North America. Corn became a staple among enslaved people and in West Africa, as well as intermarriage, right? And intermarriage, therefore, sheltered some people who escaped from enslavement, but the food cultures, therefore, also were mixing. Some enslaved people were able to have gardens, depending upon where they were located. And many of them were, again, in communion with Native folks. There are a lot of legal statutes from the 1600 onward, where it was absolutely made illegal for Native peoples and for Africans to trade or to even engage on some levels, right? Because that solidarity would have created a powerful force that would have been in opposition to white colonials. So over time, of course, we know, and I'm truncating this tremendously, so please go read the article because it offers a very wonderful overview of the interconnectedness between Africans and Native people. But over time, you had these push-pull factors that pushed Native people onto reservations, right? And then there was this lure of land and these false promises and so forth that had Native people and African folks negotiating for survival. For Native folks, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which evicted many Native Americans in the East to lands that were given to them to the west of the Mississippi River, mostly like Oklahoma. And it dislocated their foodways, right? As the article says, as the Lumpkin article says, this further dislocated the foodways of the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Seminole nations, who had adopted many of their agricultural practices, and it pushed by their invaders as a survival strategy. And those who resisted were forcibly marched all the way to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. There was also the Long Walk of 1864 and the Buffalo Massacre of 1865. So all of this displacement of people, from enslavement to the forceful removal, all of this has had a severe impact on people's physical, psychological, emotional, and cultural lifeways, right? And this stuff, you guys, as you all very well know, gets handed down, right? Coming out of enslavement, for example, Black folks were denied 40 acres and a mule. We were set free with nothing. I have a whole nother conversation about Juneteenth, and I'm happy to answer questions about it, because we have to stop just simply celebrating Juneteenth and recognize what it means that some 2 years after the formal enslavement, you had a whole group of people who had no idea that they were no longer technically bound. But then what does that mean to be set free with nothing? Where am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? Where are my children? Where's my husband? Where's my wife? Where's my mama, my daddy, whatever? That is traumatic. And I think it's important for us to recognize how trauma and displacement affect our bodies. Now you're talking generations of trauma for Black folks and for Native people, Black people who ended up throughout the South, going into sharecropping situations which were very minimally different in some instances than enslavement itself. And then, of course, Native people who are now thrust onto spaces where they can't grow food, and they're in constant angst about having their land taken, having their relatives killed and murdered before them. So we're talking here now about a history of trauma. Okay, fast forward now to the 21st or the 20th century. And you end up with a narrative of many formerly enslaved people inhabiting still the southern region, but not all of them. And we know that migration wasn't just northward, it was also eastward, it was westward, it was central. And that's really important for us to understand why, for example, you may have a number of Mississippians or people who eat similarly to those in Mississippi in Illinois, because Mississippi, the route from especially Mississippi to Chicago, was one of the major migratory routes. There's another really good article that I didn't share because it may not be easily accessible, but it was written by a colleague named Tracy Poe, and she talks directly about the migration of formerly maybe 2, 3, 4 generations out of Black people who migrated from Mississippi to Chicago, and the effect that it had on the food culture and the effect that that Northern food culture had on them. Well, you still have a lot of those folks still in the Chicago and surrounding areas, some of the areas that you all represent. This is really, really important because these folks have their roots in a very particular part of the South. So some of the food patterns you may be seeing and some of those that you may be having experiences with are very much born out of coming directly from those particular regions of the country. As we move forward, now we've been hearing more and more about issues of Black people dying of heart disease and hypertension, diabetes. Everybody has gotten in on the conversation. So for example, Walmart, this is, I believe, Target, if I'm not mistaken, you know, where places like Walmart that have this kind of, you know, foodstuffs, but also have a fair amount of other kinds of foodstuffs that may be a bit more enticing, but are not necessarily good for you. And I need to be very clear, I'm not a spokesperson for Walmart. I'm just using this because it's one of the many places that people access food. For example, I teach a video called Good Meat, and it's the story of a Lakota resident by the name of Bo LeBeau, and it's some years old now, and he's on the Pine Ridge Reservation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but his mother had died very young of diabetes, and he was on what he felt was the same path, and so he decided he wanted to eat a more indigenous diet. And so he encountered some people on the reservation to help him with this, and they created this documentary. Well, Mr. LeBeau was trying to get access to, among other things, buffalo. And he found out he had to go through the Department of Interior. He then had to spend an exorbitant amount of money for which he got a grant to kill, dress, and then prepare the buffalo, much of which his family would not eat. Instead, they preferred to go to Walmart, which was 90 miles down the road. The challenge for him was not that they would go to Walmart, but was that he had a lot of nieces and nephews who were more interested in the sugary foods that were sold at Walmart. And so, you know, his sisters would cave to that pressure, and they would come back with a lot of stuff that he couldn't eat. And it fostered a real challenge then in his household to being able to eat a traditional diet in order to what he felt was to lose weight. He also encountered the fact that on the reservation, there was a lot of red clay. And so he was unable to grow his own food. So there were a number of challenges that I work with students to understand when they very much advocate, well, you should eat local food, you should eat this kind, you should eat that kind. You know, people who don't eat those things do so just because they don't want to. No, oftentimes people make very sound decisions because they live complex lives. We all live complex lives, and we're having to negotiate these kinds of historical influences that have persisted into the current moment. So then what do people do? How do people eat in the meantime? In my new book, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, I have a chapter, the last chapter is called Eating in the Meantime. And it's based on my experiences traveling around the country after the imprint of my first book, and hearing people say things like, well, you know, growing your own food is the best thing you can do. And why aren't people eating more fresh foods and this, that, and the other? And I went to a seminar, a panel. I was on a panel up in New England, and I heard a social worker talk about her elderly clients. And she said two things. A lot of them don't eat because they don't have food, right? And so therefore they can't take their medication. And so she said, you know, this becomes a real issue because they're on a fixed income. And I started thinking about my own parents. who, though still married, live apart. And I'm watching their gradual decline because as their friends pass away, they are without the community and companionship to eat with. They're both on fixed incomes. So one of the things I talk about in that chapter, in the meantime, is how the dollar store can become a very viable place for acquiring food. There's a woman named the Dollar Diva in Philadelphia, and she wrote a book that was put in the Dollar Tree about how she was caring for her 70-year-old mother. And she would do the same thing. She would buy all kinds of different foods at her local Dollar Tree or dollar store, which obviously now some of them accept food stamps. But being able to buy vegetables, even though they may be canned and that's very sodium laden, you just have to maybe rinse them off a bit, but you've got some access to that. You've got a variety of frozen foods, not all of which are what we call healthy, but processed foods, but they also enable someone to eat and be able to take their medication. But then some dollar stores also have a number of fresh products and things like poultry, enabling folks to make a variety of kinds of meals. And I'm happy to talk more about this because it can engender a lot of conversation. So I wanted to just move forward to say that, in contemporary America, we have to be very clear that it's not just people who are on fixed incomes and low incomes who are not eating well, okay? Food spending, according to Elizabeth Frazio et al., in contemporary America, food spending rises with income, but the form that the additional spending takes is food away from home and other foods at the grocery store. So a lot of us tend to eat out, whether it's Boston Market or Cava or whatever is your Chick-fil-A or whatever is your place of choice, or other kinds of takeout, whether it's Indian, Asian, burgers and fries or what have you. As you have more disposable income, we do tend to eat out because 9 times out of 10, we're also working the types of jobs that make it extremely difficult as well to manage all of these different factors at one time. And so all of us, therefore, are in positions where we are not necessarily consuming enough fruits and vegetables to meet recommendations, quite frankly. So as they go on, Frazio et al. Go on to suggest there are other factors beside income that play a strong role in fruit and vegetable purchasing behavior. So it's not just among those of our brethren and sistren who are in rural areas and who may be on limited or fixed incomes. One of the things that Jason Lusk says, and he's a very seemingly angry journalist. He says, "Let me tell you what I know. Both my grandmothers raised chickens in their backyard and wrung a neck when it was supper time. Unlike today's generation, they didn't farm their backyards to find existential meaning, but out of cruel, dirt-poor necessity." So these folks were hardscrabble, is what he said. "I'm all for people who want to move out of the country to try their hand at hobby farming, more power to you, but don't lecture those who've been there and done that. My grandmother might occasionally reminisce about simpler times, but she remembers well the unplumbed, unwired house in which she raised my father and his siblings, and those of us that close to a life the food police romanticize and seek to return to, even if by regulatory force say enough. We've had our backyard chickens and Tyson is just fine." So this is a response then to the many people, for example, who I encounter who really, really, really push gardening and growing your own food as the means to a healthier lifestyle. For one, oftentimes that conversation doesn't take into consideration trans-migrant people, right? So for 15 or more years, I was married to a West African man from Ghana, West Africa. A staple in our household was the West African yam, which is very similar to the tuber, to the potato, but it's not. It's the yam, right? And so we had to have yam. We cooked with palm oil, and this was very critical to him to be able to have West African food. I didn't cook it. Either he did, or we would go to what is known as the wache lady. That is the lady who would make the peas and rice or the jollof rice that he was used to eating along with the sauce and the meat, which in this case may have been goat, along with the gari. And we still eat that food. My daughter has very much of both West African palate as well as an American South palate. Sometimes we would have fried fish with pepper sauce and banku, but these foods were very, very much a part of his cultural memory and his cultural life ways. And so it became very important that we added these foods to our Ghanaian, Virginian household, right? And so eating these foods, also known as soul food, in many African and African-American communities is part of a cultural tradition that is directly tied to our families, our communities, our histories, our memories. They are intensely personal. Okay, and I talk in Eating While Black about how some shaming occurred in my Ghanaian African-American household because everyone is protecting their cultural lifeways, right? And so we have to be very critical and attentive to that. So I say all of this because, especially for African Americans, soul food and foods of our culture tend to be very much ridiculed, right? Oh, soul food is going to kill you. You're going to die because, yeah. Okay. Well, that's allowing food to do a lot of heavy lifting, right? And as my colleague Kimberly Nettles says, if food itself is the culprit, then the answer is simply to stop consuming it. But the threat of disease and death fails to quell the urge to prepare and consume foods that are part of a cultural tradition, foods that are valued as a positive part of communal life. Despite the plethora of light soul food cookbooks that attempt to save soul food by encouraging the retelling of narratives that honor family, love, and community, while simultaneously advocating personal responsibility and restraint, they even don't go far enough. These books pay very little attention to the problems endemic to our contemporary food system that contribute to disease and environmental degradation. So here's what I want to say here. Black folks and Native people have been through centuries of trauma in this country. How dare we try to focus on food as the reason that we are dying? How dare we? Because in doing that, we absolve ourselves of having to deal with the very real systemic and systematic inequalities that we face day to day as a result of the fact that many Native peoples are still living on the res, and many African American people are still without running water and plumbing. And if you don't think this is true, you should look up and Google Bayview, Virginia, and Alice Coles, and take a look at the 60-minute documentary where in 1998, you had Black people who did not know that electricity could operate from the wall and turn lights on in the ceiling. I don't have to tell you all this. I'm sure that you've encountered people in your own locales who are experiencing this type of life. Well, it didn't just happen yesterday. This is as a result of enslavement and the forced removal of people off of their native land onto reservations, and then the experience of eminent domain, urban renewal, redlining, the inability to get loans for houses, unemployment, bad maternal health care, you name it. All the things that in our contemporary conversations, we want to act as if they just happened in 2016 and 2017, or in 2020 during the pandemic. No, these traumas have centuries of history that inform how we eat from a celebratory point of view and how we eat from or don't eat from a systemic inequality point of view. So you want to say, okay, well, what about obesity among African Americans? Well, we do know there's something called the stroke belt, right? And we also know that this is a region of people. As a doctor shared with me one time, she said, it's a whole region. It's not just one particular racial or ethnic group. It is a region that we have to be concerned about, because while we're touting in Food and Wine the consumption of good food that is made from natural ingredients of butter and so forth and so on, those same products, when consumed by Black people, are then said to be unhealthy. So I think we need to create healthy bodies by redefining the food stories that define our cultures. We want to encourage, of course, culturally relevant foods. You don't have to stop eating your greens, your cabbage, your onions, your butter beans, corn, tomatoes, and so forth and so on. Maybe you like them sauteed. Maybe you even want to fry them occasionally. That's fine. But let's encourage these things, these foods, which I know you all do. We also can encourage things like salt because salt tastes good, right? But we want to be able to encourage our folks to measure as opposed to using the entire salt shaker. At the same time, some folks are like, I like the entire salt shaker because I'm gonna die from something. And if I do, I want to die happy because my food is well salted. All right. And so we already know, I'm not going to say to an African person, you can't use palm oil because palm oil is a staple and it carries a particular taste, and to not use it does begin to affect the palate. At the same time, you have many folks who will use olive oil or other kinds of oils for their food. And we know we can share with our clients, our friends, our family that soul food absolutely can be and is often good for you by eating from this particular pyramid, which is the African Heritage Diet Pyramid. And this isn't just for African Americans, from Native to Malaysia to Canada, they have different types of food pyramids, or they did some back in 2005. They had these different types of pyramids to help people feel a lot more connected to the foods that made sense to them. Old Ways Food Heritage is another place that celebrates and recognizes African food culture. And then as I'm closing out, I just want to talk a minute about the whole gardening piece. I'm not adverse to folks gardening. What I'm adverse to is us believing that the only way people can achieve good health is to garden. Not everybody has that thumb. There are some who do, like my former neighbor in Buffalo, New York, Miss Shipman, who has a beautiful, I don't know how she manages to do this in Buffalo where it's cold like 99% of the time. And it's overcast as well, but she's transitioned now, but back when she was with us, you see this beautiful batch here of look like turnip greens and maybe some poke and some other things in the background. She had a beautiful bounty. Or this man here who has different types of greens and tomatoes and other kinds of fruits and vegetables. There are those, however, in the African American community in particular, who do not want to garden for a number of reasons: migration, the cultural histories and legacies, the discriminatory practices by the USDA, which continue to this day, the stigmas around slavery and agriculture and the appearance of being country. And that when you are struggling, sometimes it can be really hard because gardening and farming are not easy processes, right? Between seeds and fertilizers and so forth, it can be a lot, especially when you have to work outside the home. So understanding that also Black folks, Native peoples, Asians and Latinos do not have the same relationships to land that white folks do, right? Who come most often in their families somewhere from a legacy of colonialism and colonization. And so your relationship to land may be very different from someone else's. And so we have to be very careful about that. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, where I was talking about the Lakota people and Bolabo, they have managed to figure out a way to get the soil to where they need it to be, so that they don't have to make necessarily a frequent 80-mile trip to the grocery store, to Walmart. They are on some portion of the land, apparently they have found a place to grow things like potatoes, herbs, corn, and tomatoes and so forth. Some of the foods that are directly connected to their food cultures. And so as I'm closing out, I want to just remind you of something that my colleague said, and I want to encourage us to think along these lines. And that's not paper or plastic thinking, right? She says paper or plastic thinking begins by constructing our ethical choices as a dichotomy. You do this or you do that, all right? She says, and this is Lisa Helke is a philosopher, and she was given this paper at a food conference, and she read this, and I was like, this is so on point. She said, would-be ethical food consumers approach every alternative food campaign as a kind of moral, social, ecological litmus test. To be a good person, you must eat vegetarian, eat vegan, eat organic, eat local, eat biodynamic, eat fair trade, eat authentic, eat this. She said, I applaud these individual efforts to challenge the industrial agro-food system. I do not applaud their tendency to reduce moral life to a set of rigid choices that, if made correct, can make me good. And I absolutely agree with Lisa, right? Oftentimes, we don't even necessarily realize it, but we are infusing our own moralistic, ethical biases into our conversations, even if we don't intend to do that. That's why locating yourself on a daily basis, your privileges, your opportunities, your backgrounds, your cultures, it's a daily thing almost. It's not something you can do one time and think that that it'll be done, because there are folks for whom collard greens and fried chicken and mac and cheese is some good food, and it's food that very much is a touchstone of one's heritage. Or it could be collard greens with turkey, or it could be the vegetarian tomato, asparagus, lettuce, kind of arugula concoction, or it can be a vegan a dish of collard or kale and mac and cheese, or macaroni salad and the tofu and with some other kind of vegetable protein, seitan or what have you, and some cornbread. It could be any one of these configurations, right? For Native peoples, it could be fry bread. It could be a 3-bean kind of a food dish. It could be something that also involves the 3 sisters of tomatoes and corn and beans, right? All of these things are very relevant. All of these foods are very relevant, and they are mired in our very particularistic histories that inform who we are today and how we move about the world today, and very much can be the thing that's keeping us on this earth on some level, right? The fact that every Sunday I'm gonna have this big dinner, or every holiday I'm gonna have, they're the things that give us joy and help us thrive. That's part of what is the meaning of cultural sustainability, right? That you allow yourself and you allow other people to connect to the things that make them who they are. And when we say to people, you can't do this anymore, you need to now do more of that, we have to be very careful about how we're moving people's lives, because that's what we're doing. These are people's things. They're very much contextualized in histories of trauma, in histories of joy, in histories of discovery, in lots of different histories. And so when we think policy and when we think about devising and writing grants, we want to keep all of this in our mind's eye, because we need to bring it to bear on the arguments we're making for why we're doing the work we're doing. Because our goal as humans, our goal is working with people, whether it's in teaching or in helping move folks to a different life ways. Our goal is for people to walk away whole and feeling whole. It is never to leave people in a situation where they are going to feel somehow that they are not who we would like for them to be as citizens moving about the world, dealing with injustice on a regular basis, dealing with just everyday life, mental, emotional, psychological, economic health, right? Our goal really is to get people to a place where we understand that for them to be humane, they may have to live differently than what our policies would dictate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams-Forson. That was absolutely incredible, and you are getting so much love and accolades in the chat. We do have about 3 minutes left, so I can share. Oh, it was all needed to be said. So I can share the first question we got, and if you're open to it, I can send additional questions to you afterwards. So the first question we got is, do the issues of clean water, thinking about Flint and Mississippi, lack of access and other challenges surprise you, or are they business as usual to you? And how do you manage your emotions as people act like this is new?
Great, thank you. Yeah, of course they matter, and this is no different, right? I mean, what we're seeing today, lack of access, all of that, and it's very much tied to, as I was saying, redlining, is tied to shutting people's water off. It's tied to denying people just the basic opportunity to live in areas that are going to be safe and free of gun and police violence. Absolutely. How do I manage my emotions as people act like this is new? That's a great question. I just look at them and I say, this is not new. Okay, what part of the history of America do we not understand that the present has a past? When I'm talking to some people, I let them know, I'm like, the chain remained the same. It just has a different look, right? So I just think that we have to be very clear to try and protect your health, your mental and emotional health when you're dealing with people like that, because the daily trying to help people to see that just because you hear it on a soundbite from a politician doesn't mean that this is something that just started today. This is not critical race theory. This is American history. Like it or love it, it is what it is. And so I think that's the thing that I try to do on a daily basis. Thank you for that question.
It's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. And I'd love to try and squeeze one more in. Another person asked, could you speak more on healthy enough meals from Dollar Tree and Dollar General? I work with mothers transitioning out of shelters.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, again, in the Dollar Trees that I've experienced, and I go to a lot because, you know, I used to have a young child who's now 18, but I still go to them a lot. You can find things like beans. You can find a lot of frozen vegetables, especially if the dollar store has a frozen food section. But let me also just clue you into something. There are some grocery stores, not just Aldi and Food Lion, and some grocery stores also sell similar foods for a very reduced price. A lot of the foods, at least out here in the Northeast, are labeled WIC accessible or and so forth, so people can tag those foods. But absolutely, Dollar Tree and those food stores, you know, you can also Google Dollar Tree meals and you'll get lots of recipes. And some of them are just pasta and beans with a red vegetable, I mean, a green vegetable, right? That can be made with olive oil and some seasonings. So I think the ways in which you can help them to experience this in a very non-labor intensive way is going to be it's going to go far.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. So I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all the questions, but I will send those as follow-up, and we can send any additional information we get to all of you as registrants.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. So thank you again so very much, Dr. Williams-Forson, for the incredible information that you've shared, and to all of you for joining us today. We are really looking forward to seeing you at the next session, which is Eating with Our Neighbors, How to Identify Injustices and Create Change in Food and Nutrition Programs. That session will be on Tuesday, September 27th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. And please keep an eye out for your Racism and Food Access and Nutrition Culture worksheet to be sent via email. That worksheet will include the resources that Dr. Williams-Forson mentioned, and other resources as well for you to review and consider, and a place to note any questions that you have for the next session speakers and for each other in advance of that session. So thank you all again very much, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.